Thank you very much. You have a handout on your chairs, and the handout doesn't exactly duplicate the PowerPoint, but it's meant as a guide. I'm going to go through 3 slides, have some time for questions of clarification, another 3 slides on your handout, clarification. At the end, we'll be able to have general discussion. But I gave it to you so you can track some of the ideas. So our question is how to liberate the work instinct from the economy. And from Hillman. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Hillman, I wanted to paraphrase an obituary that was written by my colleague Mary Watkins. That James Hillman is arguably the most radical, thought-provoking American psychologist since William James. And he passed away a little over a year ago. He's the author of more than 20 books, translated into 25 languages. He was the founder of archetypal psychology, a post-Jungian school of thought that emphasizes the importance of imagination, beauty, and justice, all within the context of a transformed notion of the human soul. The body of his work probes the fields of psychology, philosophy, mythology, art, and cultural studies in strikingly novel ways. I was, as Carol mentioned, I was lucky enough to have him as one of my professors in graduate school at the University of Dallas. And it was quite an interesting experience. I didn't know who James Hillman was before I went to Dallas, and he's had a tremendous influence on my thinking. Well, this saying, and it comes at the end of a book that Hillman wrote in the 90s on power, a book addressed to the business community. Because he says in the business community we have the most creative thinking going on today. And he makes this directive at the end, and it's his version of what Carol mentioned earlier. The saying, think globally, act locally. This is Hillman's version. And it's from the book on power, and then an essay on welfare that he wrote about a decade later, and then an earlier book that he wrote in the 80s called Interviews, that I'm going to take his thought about work. So, subtle. The Oxford American Dictionary defines subtle as so delicate or precise as to be difficult to analyze or describe. Making use of clever and indirect methods to achieve something, capable of making fine distinctions, arranged in an ingenious and elaborate way. Hillman says that for action to be direct and single, thought must be diverse and plural. Subtlety recognizes complexity, it celebrates multiplicity, and then it directs action in a straightforward way. Thinking in this way makes a difference. Now, I might be the only one in the room who has not read the Jobs biography, but I do read Time, and they had this great article called What Would Steve Do? And I was looking for Eisenstadt in there, but it was the other one. So this is what Jobs told Isaacson. My passion has been to build an enduring company where people were motivated to make great products. Everything else was secondary. Sure, it was great to make a profit because that's what allowed you to make great products. But the products, not the profits, were the motivation. It's a subtle difference, but it ends up meaning everything. The people you hire, who gets promoted, what you discuss in meetings. Separating product from profits, making great profits the goal rather than reducing products to profits. It's an example of subtle thinking, a thinking which identifies a difference that matters. What this does is allows Apple to act simply, in the sense of putting things like who you work with and what you talk about into perspective. Well, of course this is what you talk about in meetings. Of course it makes sense to promote this person. When you recognize this subtle difference, that it's about the products, not about profit, then the other things fall into place. It's a perspective that drives one of the most successful companies in the world. Thinking subtly is what makes it possible for action to be straightforward. Without subtle thinking, action becomes confused. What we're going to think about today, and to think subtly about, is work. You know, Freud said the whole business of therapy was to bring a person to love and work. It seems to me that we've forgotten half of what he said, work. Hillman used to always say that work was really important to being human. That was just, it was there all the time for him. He valued work, no matter what kind of work it was. He says if people didn't have work, they weren't fulfilled. It was always important to him. He dedicated a section of his 1983 book Interviews, which I mentioned earlier, to discussing work. And there he says, I think that there's a work instinct and that it developed human civilization. In the very beginning of the book, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. He wrote in 1991. Hillman notes, the thing that therapy pushes is relationship, yet work may matter just as much as relationships. Therapy pushes the relationship issues, but what intensifies these issues is that we don't have A, satisfactory work, or B, even more important perhaps, we don't have satisfactory political community. He goes on to say, you just can't make up for the loss of passion and purpose in your daily work by intensifying your personal relationships. I think we talk so much about inner growth and development because we're so boxed in to petty private concerns on our jobs. There's a reason why Freud said love and work, not just love. Work matters. Work is not working. And that's where we start. As depth psychologists, we always start with the symptom. And symptoms are not problems to be solved. They're disclosive. They tell us something. As Hillman liked to say, symptoms like to be listened to, not looked into. We have to pay attention to it. In the global financial crisis, people are out of work, or even when they have a job, they feel like they're slaves to work, while some of the most financially rewarding work all too often has no conscience and is socially destructive. Think of the banking and financial services industries. Quoting a recent news article, even Americans who are lucky enough to have work in this economy are becoming more unhappy with their jobs. According to a survey that found only 45% of Americans are satisfied with their work. That was the lowest level ever recorded by the Conference Board Research Group in more than 22 years of studying the issue. One clue that may explain workers' dissatisfactions, only 51% now find their jobs interesting. Another low in 25 years of surveying. 51% find their jobs interesting. That means 49, half the people are bored by their jobs. Listening to the breakdown of work as a symptom directs us to larger cultural issues, the issues that Hillman dedicated his work to addressing. The bottom line here is that work is not working because it's lost all the ways of deep relatedness that Matthew Fox spoke about so movingly yesterday afternoon. Work has lost its way and fallen prey to a kind of literalism. It's gotten lost in the global myth astutely identified by Betty Sue Flowers last night. In 1999, Hillman wrote a book called The Force of Character. And in that book he said, and I quote, "My war, and I've yet to win a decisive battle," he put up a hell of a fight, "is with the modes of thought and conditioned feeling that prevail in psychology and therefore in the way we think and feel about our being. Of these conditions, none are more tyrannical than the convictions that clamp the mind and heart into positivistic science, geneticism and computerism, economics, bottom-line capitalism, and single-minded faith, fundamentalism. Indeed, Hillman's psychology can be understood as an insurrection waged against monotheistic literalisms, such as economics, but not economics in total. Keep in mind that Hillman ran a business, a publishing company of which he was both owner and editor, Spring Publications, and of which I was an employee for a half dozen years. In fact, he taught me how to do business, how to negotiate, how to cut deals, how to organize, how to transact business. Hillman was a capitalist, and he was a good businessman. So it's not that economics, per se, is tyrannical. It's rather a specific kind of economics. bottom-line capitalism that clamps the mind and heart by reducing all matters to the calculation of profit. Remember Jobs wanting to create a company in which people were motivated? And he did this in no small part by separating products from profit. He put great products before the calculations of profit. In his 2001 address, Farewell to Welfare, Hillman is outraged at, quote, unbridled late-stage capitalism, euphemistically called the free market economy, and he flat out describes it as a runaway nightmare. He proceeds to draw our attention to the distressing facts of this economic system, from the number of people below the poverty line and how many of them are children, to the necessity of 2 wage earners for a family to keep up and just pay the bills. While discussing this economy's single-minded focus upon growth of profit, he points out that, and I quote, depression shadows economic expansion with job insecurity, dislocation of families, downsizing, pink slips, rising personal debt, and bankruptcies also forced higher productivity. He cautions, beware of taking free market economics as a science, or as a progressively developing system, or as equivalent with and necessary to our American dream of political democracy. The economy which rules in our lives is also a morality, a psychology, and even a monotheistic belief that converts all values into its one bottom line, end quote. These sentiments echo what he earlier recognized in the book Kinds of Power. He says business is defined by the ideas of Western capitalism has become the fundamental force in human society. You see how much these echo what Betty Sue was talking about last night. Very much on the same page, that this modern myth covers everything. It's the first global myth. What Hillman says is that it's, as any monotheism, it propagates a fundamentalist belief in its basic tenets, a fundamentalist belief that takes itself literally, as fact, rather than perspective. Business ideas have penetrated and then colonized most of life, public and private. They've become internalized, and they rule by psychological means. Indeed, they are so unquestioningly and universally accepted, it's the economy where, according to Hillman, quote, the contemporary unconscious resides and where psychological analysis is needed. This unconscious, which Hillman says is in the daily round of business, appears in both the repression of any other ideas with which to envision the social, political, and historical realities of the daily round. Again, what Betty Sue was talking about last night. This way of looking at things, and she pointed out, I think quite correctly, it's fear-driven. It doesn't leave any room to think about things in any other way. So that it represses all these other ideas, and then it disrupts the business-defined daily round by the symptomatic return of the human realities that have been repressed, like the depression that follows expansion that we heard Hillman refer to earlier. The oppressive reign of defining reality in terms of business is correlate with the economic injustice that is widespread today and is testified to by the ever-widening gap between the 99% and the 1%. Indeed, in 2000, Hillman remarked that today's world resembles 1900, when there was protest and rebellion against economic injustice. And my colleague Mary Watkins, as I think pointed out quite astutely, Hillman in many ways was far ahead of the Occupy movement. He was like its prophet. If you pay attention to his writings, he was there far earlier than it happened. So what is work like when economics is its unconscious? Instead of being a consideration, economics becomes the determination in a literal and unilateral way of work. This appears in everything from efficiency studies to valuations of human capital. It also appears, as Hillman notes, in the language of economics usurping all the soul's terms for richness and worth, value, interest, assets, etc. It shapes the way we talk about everything. It shapes the way we look at everything. It becomes the only measure of reality. Before continuing with our discussion about the economic unconscious, I want to stop at this point. So, just to make sure we're on the same page here, and if you have questions or comments, you don't have to go to the mic, I'll repeat them if there's anything you want to bring up. So we're starting with the recognition that something's broken, which is the typical, Hillman always says all of depth psychology begins with Freud. It begins with the symptom, paying attention to the system, but not taking it at face value, not just seeing it as in a problem-solving manner, but recognizing that it tells us about something which is unseen, a latency, and then paying attention to that. And this is where we come to the economic unconscious. The problems that are going on with work are not that we're not working harder or we're not paying attention to work. It has to do with how work is configured. It has to do with the ideas of the economy usurping the place of any other imagination. We'll move on. Please. So her comment is that it's permeated education as well, that business interests have permeated education. It's about teaching competencies, and about competencies that are understood to be relative to the job market. And what happens is the humanities get left out. In my field, psychology, there is a major movement to define psychology as a STEM discipline, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The humanities are left out. They want to cut any connection to the social sciences. But it's in the humanities that we have the imagination of what makes life human. And how the hell can you have a psychology that looks at us as a kind of machine? We miss the very things which are human. So, and yes, and we find it everywhere today. So this is, it's widespread, it's cultural. It doesn't just affect work, it affects everything. Anyone else? Please. Right. So we're educating people to get jobs in business, but there's no jobs. And of course, well, maybe this is one of the paradoxical things that came up yesterday, that this will bring about a change. I feel very sorry for young people graduating today with the economy being so bad. I have a son who recently graduated in the last few years. There's just not jobs. There's not opportunities. It's a complex situation that we're in. But the place where I want to stand is about recognizing these. Of course they're problems, but as depth psychologists, we need to first understand what's being spoken here, what's latent here. That's what we need to address. So let's go back and talk more about that one. So we want to free work. The ideas of business, profit, productivity, expense, exchange, demand, depreciate, market, manage, and the like are ubiquitous and unquestioned, taken as literal truths about reality, the pure and simple, that's the way things is. As Hillman notes, these ideas trickle down into each act of making, serving, choosing, and keeping that we perform. We are each, every one of us, in business. And as much as this is the case, these ideas, which we don't know we have because we're only conscious of them, if at all, as literal facts. These ideas have us. And this is why, as Hillman explains in Farewell to Welfare, and I quote, "I have more and more shifted my psychological practice from the individual psyche in the consulting room to the wider psyche in the public arena. Our motto here is for the sake of serving the soul in the world," following Hillman's influence. The wider psyche in the public arena and its deeper roots in root ideas. I call my work now a therapy of ideas rather than a therapy of persons. End quote. Work is one of the root ideas that's fallen prey to the repressive dynamic of the economy. The dominant idea of work is defined by the bottom line. The literalism of the link between money and work keeps people in chains that makes us feel like slaves. It's here, and with his astute vision and skillful hand, that Hillman makes a characteristic move. I quote, "If we could just loosen that linkage between money and work, work could be returned to instinct, and it could be reimagined as a psychological phenomena, a soul activity, not an economic activity merely." Note, he does not say that work is not an economic activity. That's not the problem. It's reducing it to only being an economic activity. That's the issue. Hillman's loosening the linkage between money and work is the same kind of hermetic move he makes in The Force of Character. There he argued, when investigating growing old, that it's crucial to our inquiry to decouple death from aging and instead restore the ancient link between old age and the uniqueness of character. Only in this way can we, as he says, recognizing that aging is necessary for the human condition, intended by the soul, end quote. Just as when we conceive of aging exclusively in terms of death, and thereby remain unconscious of its value in conditioning human life, and then, of course, aging is something to be feared, something to be denied, something to be run away from, because it has no value other than death, unless we see it in terms of character. We need to, in the same way, untie work from money if we're to see through to its psychological necessity as a matter of the soul. When liberated from being literally defined in terms of the bottom line, work is free, according to Hillman, to its own end and brings its own joy. One can even fall in love with the work. As Hillman notes in the book The Soul's Code, and I quote, "A similar sense of destiny, if less sudden and less heated, and a similar devotion can mark falling for a place, even for a work, as well as for a person." Even more, the instinctual character of work, its necessary relationship to our humanness, can come into view when work is no longer literally linked to money. It's not that money doesn't count, or that there shouldn't be any linkage between the two. Equal pay, a living wage, performance evaluations, merit pay are all necessary but not sufficient conditions for the work instinct to come into play. Hillman recognizes that one has to have a fantasy so that work can go on. And he says the fantasies we have about it, that is about work, are economic and sociological, and they keep it from going on. So we have, in his reckoning, a huge problem of productivity and quality in our Western work. He does not, as far as I can find, give us a fantasy of work, an idea of work which can illuminate its soulful necessity, a way of imagining work comparable to the idea of character he used to illuminate aging. Or for that matter, but in another area, comparable to the notion of the anima mundi that Hillman resurrects as antidote to the lifeless concept of a dead material world. Hillman's understanding of character and the notion of the anima mundi are retrieved from the ancient Greek, Neoplatonic, Renaissance, and Romantic traditions of depth psychology that he did so much to perpetuate. Hence, although Hillman himself does not do so, it's not surprising that a comparable notion of work can be found in one of the precursors, as Hillman calls them, of archetypal psychology, the Renaissance humanism of Gian Battista Vico. Gian Battista Vico, early 18th century professor of eloquence. I love that, professor of eloquence. He was a rhetorician at the University of Naples. Well-versed in law, history, philosophy, and philology, Vico made a last stand for the classical model of learning and education in the face of the rising mechanistic sciences and the dominance of causal explanation in Western modernity. Most well known for his work, The New Science, his contemporary influence spans philosophy, critical theory, and literature, and reaches all the way to depth psychology and the human sciences. I follow the philosopher Ernesto Grassi, a phenomenologist, a student of Heidegger, in taking Vico to define work as the enactment of imaginative ingenuity in the service of human needs and desires. Imaginative ingenuity grasps the multiple relatedness of what appears as the opening of the human context. So it grasps what appears in terms of the human context. It relates what appears to human needs and desires. Work alone, asserts Grassi, is able to prove the objectivity of ingenious and imaginative activities by their success in leading to a result. So this is the thing about work. Work takes that imagination and it tries it out to see whether it matches what the world gives us or not, to see whether it actually works out. The source of these ingenious and imaginative capacities, the ingenuum, is more than a particular capacity, one among others, as it is the disclosive engagement that constitutes the very humanity of humans. Vico recognizes this when he observes, ingenuum is the power of connecting separate and diverse elements. Moreover, ingenuum and natura meant the same in Latin. Is that because human ingenuity is man's nature, since its first function is to see the proportion of things, what is suitable, fitting, beautiful, and base? Ingenuum intuits the commonality between the world's appearances and human needs. It apprehends the appropriateness of the things of the world to the fulfillment of human desire. It sees this match. The signification ingeniously disclosed is then transferred upon the world through the metaphorical movement of imagination. Imagination grants meaning to things, thereby allowing them to be seen as significant, to be seen as something that matters. Imagination, writes Grassi, is the original faculty of letting see, so that Vico himself calls it the eye of the ingenuum. So these connections, they're seen through imagination. Imagination is seeing these connections. Together, ingenuum and imagination transform nature into culture. Previously unapprehended significations are brought together in a nexus of relationships which are rendered as context and circumstance for our concern and action. Work embodies and acts upon the meaningfulness disclosed in imaginative ingenuity in order to provide for humankind's worldly dwelling. So at this point, we've unhooked work and money, and now we're trying to find a different way to imagine it. That's why we've turned to Vico. And this very, very old notion, when Vico talks about ingenuum, he refers way back to the Romans, to the Latins. His work in which he finds this is on the ancient wisdom of the Italians as present in the Latin language. So he finds it in the way that people think about things, the way they speak about things, a different way of thinking and speaking about things, which says that what it is to be human is to be always engaged in the world in a meaningful way. Meaning in the sense that we see things in relationship to ourselves, to others, and to other concerns. There's a connecting of things. And the seeing of connections is what's embodied in work. Work takes up these connections. Work acts upon these connections. And that's why work is so important for Grassi and for Vico, because it tells us whether these connections actually work, or are they just fantasy in the sense of mere fabrications. So here we're moving to a whole different way of understanding the character of work. We on the same page? We doing well? Okay. So, whenever one was given a task by Hillman at Spring Publications, the instructions were first, wrap your mind around it. And of course, if you did well, he would go, you really wrapped your mind around that one. That was the highest praise. What wrapping your mind around it, it was like Vico's ingenious imagination. You were supposed to see how things were connected. You were asked to explore whatever it was in its relationship to the concerns and interests of the business. You were expected to figure things out in terms of how they mattered to what mattered to Spring. That's what it meant to wrap your mind around it. Figure out what's going on and how does it relate to us and the things we're concerned about. Early in, well, this must have been the 80s. We had a small company. There was maybe 10 employees. And a lot of us were still in graduate school. And we went to Hillman and said, we need health care. We don't have health insurance. And I got to say, he said, yeah, you don't have health insurance, but you should. Wrap your mind around it. Figure out how to get us the best, the cheapest health insurance, and I'll go for it. And he did it. And I always got to give him credit for that. That was far ahead of time. And it's not that, I mean, it was his sense of justice that was involved there. You know, and he put his money where his mouth was in that moment. And, you know, I have great respect for that. That was another example. He charged me with it, and the way he says, wrap your mind around it. And then the directive was to get your hands into it. Engage, utilize, take up, try out what it is that you had wrapped your mind around. Make sure that rubber hits the road, that you really get a handle on it. And it actually happens in the way you imagine. In short, work with it. Work on it. Work in order to see if, as in Vico's notion of work, the ingenious imagination really does work out. That would then set the stage for the productive engagement appropriate to the tasks at hand. Whether packing books, making sales calls, tabulating royalties, editing manuscripts, composing copy, or crafting editorial statements. All the kinds of work that one did at Spring Publications. It all had this basic format. First you had to wrap your mind around it, then you got your hands into it. Get your hands into it. But there's a problem here, as he says. And it's imagining the hands as mindless, as only physical. That's where the whole problem of work begins, right here, in undervaluing and misapprehending the hands. Sometimes, you know, you feel like you can channel somebody. You know, but Hillman always, when he spoke, you could see his hands at work. Well, the hands that work are not only physical. They are also, even primarily, the hands of the gestural body. This is the body that is always already in dialogue with the world and whose form shifts in response to the situation. The body that is only physical is the anatomical body of medicine and biology. It's the body that's pictured in science textbooks, a body which is everybody's in general and nobody's in particular. Its reality is independent of context and relationship. But this is a misapprehension and an undervaluing of the body that we each are, the lived body that situates us in a particular time and space. The body we live is a gestural body whose movement expresses both a specific meaning and the broader context in which that meaning is embedded and has its frame of reference. Easy example to get this. I want you to turn to the person on your right and do this. Go ahead. Turn to the person on your right. Come on. How do you feel when you do that? If it's the anatomical body, you have the rapid movement of the eyelid up and down. Makes no difference. Doesn't matter. So what? You got a tick? But it's not, is it? It's always more. It's a wink. And what does that wink mean? It could mean many things, right? You're letting someone in on something. You're attracted to them. You want them to do something for you, right? There's meaning in that gesture. This is the eye of the gestural body. The autonomical body has no meaning. It can be any time, any place. But the gestural body always has that reference to meaning. Meaning, relationship, context. That's the world of the gestural body. That's the world that we all live in. My friend and colleague Robert Romanishin observes that the arms of the gestural body are longer when they reach out to others to offer help, and that these arms are shorter when they humbly accept a gift. I used to teach this is in Robert's book on technology. I used to teach this in the School of Leadership at Duquesne. And when the students would go to graduation, they went like this to get their diplomas. The arms of gratitude. And everybody got what they were doing, what it meant. Romanishin has noted about this body that its gestures are inseparable from the story they enact. They are bodies moved out of themselves, seduced and solicited by the world. These bodies are situated in a story and are radically unlike the immutable body of technological functioning, end quote. Romanishin describes this as a pantomimic body, insofar as it presents in its appearance the meaningful engagement of the person with others, things, and the world. For the hand of the gestural body, movement relates to meaning. The movement of the gestural hand refers to and participates in a context of meanings, relationships, a configuration of signification. When I wave hello or goodbye, and how do you know which it is? The gesture of waving makes sense and is immediately intelligible. Why? Because it conjures up or carries with it the world of our relationship, the meaningful context in which we exchange greetings and take our leave of one another. Gestures are always inseparable from context. What does this mean? If I'm not on the road, if I was on the road, it'd mean if I'm on the baseball field, you're out. In the lecture hall, it means get out of here. Right? So it's context. This gesture, you immediately wonder, well, you look around, right? When you see this gesture, you look around because you need to understand context. Without context, you're puzzled. And why are you puzzled? Because it's ambiguous. It's not because it has no meaning. It's because it has multiple meanings and you don't know which is operative. The gestural body is always meaningful. The autonomical body is never meaningful. There's a huge difference. This is how we've mistaken work. We thought about it in terms of the wrong hand. When I lower my hands and show you my palms, you know that I'm running out of something. It might be money, it might be time, it might be energy. You understand and relate to a situation, not to the change in location of the anatomical hand. You're not figuring out what is this. What does it mean is what you ask, not the movement. If across the room I point at you, you don't think that I'm trying to poke you with an anatomical digit that serves as a weapon. You understand that I'm pointing something out, or I'm pointing to you for a response. There's a meaningful relationship in that gesture, not just a mechanical activity. If the hand were only physical, it would be dumb and not speak to the surrounding context that generates its meaning. The gestural hand, whether shaking towards the sky, pointing to something with the fingers, or receiving an offering with open palms, either brings with it or imparts, depending on which way you're looking at it, a referential context of shared meaning and concern. The hand of work is the hand of the gestural body, the body whose movement expresses both a specific meaning and the broader context in which that meaning is embedded and has its frame of reference. Hillman discusses the hand in his reflections on the puer, and his summary statement of the hand portrays it in terms of contact with the world. Quote, "Our hands are exposed to all the risks of daily life. They're our first touch with the concrete, how we defend ourselves, how we express ourselves, what we give each other. In them lies our sensitivity," end quote. Which is why work is, as Grassi noted, capable of proving the objectivity of imaginative ingenuity. The hand of the gestural body connects to the whole of the daily round in which we touch and are touched by others and things. Work is first a matter of the gestural hand, the hand that concretely enacts a situational configuration of the ingenious imagination. There's an understanding, a grasping of meaning that's carried forth in the gesture. Or said differently, work is the enactment of ingenious imagination, and the hand is its enactment. Let me say that again. Work is the enactment of ingenious imagination. When we work, we're enacting this. We're seeing the connections. And the hand is its embodiment. This is the hand that guides the manipulation of the physical, but is never, as we discussed above, only physical. It is always physical, but never only physical. Next. Our title speaks of liberating the work instinct. So let's consider the notion of instinct. Freud, who taught us so much about the instincts, says that they are difficult to grasp. He says that they are magnificent, these are his words, magnificent in their indefiniteness. He calls them mythical entities. And he goes on to say that we cannot for a moment disregard them. Hillman likes to quote the Roman philosopher Sallust, who says, "Myth never happened, but always is." The instincts are mythical in the sense of a way of seeing rather than something seen. A way of seeing something fundamental rather than defining something that is a literal foundation. They're a way of looking at things that brings into view something fundamental. So what is it that the instincts for Freud bring into view? Freud says that the drives, which is a better way to translate instincts, are the demands made by the body on mental life. Let's take the soma, the body of the work instinct, to be the gestural body, and imaginative ingenuity as the form of mental life that it demands. The gestural body makes a demand on mental life. The demand gives rise to imaginative ingenuity. The gestural hand demands meaning. Its movement is never only mechanistically caused. The connections and proportional relationships, imaginatively disclosed by ingenuity, provide the meaningful context demanded by the movement of the gestural hand. You have to have a context to understand this. The context is demanded by the gesture. If we're this kind of being whose body is essentially meaningful, we need context for meaning. We need to be able to make sense of meaning. We need to be able to disclose meaning. But that's what ingenuity is about. Being this kind of gestural body demands that we make sense of things. And that's ingenuity. We are this body. We are this trying to get a handle on things. There's always a making sense of things, the seeing of relationships between the worlds appearing and our disclosing, that's configured in the hand's gestures. Recall Hillman identifying the hands as our first touch with the concrete. This is why work is capable of providing the objectivity of imaginative ingenuity. The embodiment of imaginative ingenuity in the gestural hand, that's its embodiment, it touches the world. It makes or does not make concrete contact. If it doesn't make concrete contact, it's mere fantasy. We have to let it go. But when it makes that contact, we know we were there, we're engaged. And that's the context of human dwelling. All varieties of human work begin with this contact with the concrete, which is the work instinct. Hillman notes what in German is called Triebsamkeit. I think I pronounced it correctly. A drive to be busy. He says that it's an activity co-natural with being human. People just want to do something, pick things up, straighten them up, put them away, set them in place. This fury of activity, this busyness, from which we get our term business, is never senseless, even if it's not always efficient. It always involves, however poorly, a sense of proportion, of what is suitable, of what is fitting. It's the mark of the ingenuum. It's the human engagement that connects to the world and makes it a place of habitation, makes it the site of human dwelling. We get busy, we get into things, and it's not just random action. We do things in a way that reflects an understanding of them, an engagement of them, an ordering of them. An ordering of them in terms of our humanity. It's here that nature becomes culture. So, here we're moving towards the work instinct, as Hillman would like us to do, reimagined as a psychological phenomenon, a soul activity, not an economic activity merely. We're moving away from the literalism of economic determination and the repression wrought by the singular goal of profit and the single-minded focus on growth. But there is more to work than its instinctual dimension. There is also the role of culture. For Vico, it's the sensus communis, the communal sensibility that orients people in their engagement with the world. This sensibility arises from and in turn informs imaginative ingenuity. Okay? So this original engagement happens through ingenuum. But then it creates the context which informs all other sense-making. This form of common sensibility, communal sensibility, is a referent and guide in interacting with the world. It's the accomplishment of human organization, the product of ingenuity and transforming nature into culture. Where do the hands learn to work? Asks Hillman in interviews. He points out that unlike cooking and sewing and gardening, building, and darn near everything else, there are no books on how to work. He says we learn from tools, materials, and from the others who are doing the work we are or wish to be doing. He talks about going and visiting the great mythologist Carl Karenya and seeing him at work, pasting notes on manuscripts and doing the work that he did as an academician. I think we also learn from the story that weaves together the tools and the materials with whom we work. It weaves together and thereby founds an organization's communal sensibilities, its shared mission, vision, values, its reason for being, and its ways of relating, the kind of story that Karen was talking about. We are all well aware of the importance of an organization's culture. In the best case, Apple, for example, and Carol mentioned, the Think Differently ad. In the best case, the work organization, the community organized for work, generates its own communal sensibility, a sensibility that comes from thinking subtly and results in acting simply. Creating and sustaining such a culture, and I believe it's inherently connected to the organization's story, is necessary to building what Jobs wanted, an enduring company where participants are motivated to make great products, and profits come as an essential but indirect result. This is the kind of communal sensibility that informs, inspires, and invigorates work. The organizational context in which the work instinct is liberated to being imaginative ingenuity. Thank you. I thought we'd have Hillman there with the hand while we take some questions. So please, the microphones. And it's interesting that this is, it was one of the last times that it was the last time that James was here. And he was talking about working with a purpose. And I thought that it was special to have that image here. So please, comments, questions? We have some time.
Speaking from the place of organizational narrative, I'm wondering if you can make a few comments here. In uncoupling work from money, I'm wondering if, and I'm seeing this, I'm experiencing this, I'd love to have you share some of your thoughts on this too, that stories can often be a disruptive technology. And what I mean by that is that as I work with stories and executives that I do and in the companies that I do, all of a sudden, because they're sharing their stories, they're starting to value things differently. And we're starting to get language like, I'm getting a return on relationships. And I'm getting a return on engagement, right? Completely different ways of thinking about their work and the effect of their work. And so I was thrilled when you were talking about this decoupling of work from money, and wondering from the organizational narrative perspective, what you see is going on there and what the opportunity is.
Well, and when the first thing that happens when you move into narrative, you bring in the qualitative dimension. It now has a place. It now has a voice. But even in your example, there's the tension there between the qualitative dimensions that are other than money and money evaluating, return on this and that. The language is still there. But the more that we narrate, the more we're able to bring in other discourse. Hillman would like to quote Confucius, who says, the rectification of culture begins in the rectification of language. When we start to use stories, we start to speak differently. When we speak differently, we see differently. When we see differently, we'll relate differently. And it's a process. But getting people to speak in this narrative way, the first step is it does give credence to factors which are real, that they know they're real, factors which are concrete, but that defy reduction to quantification. So it helps. It's the first step in bringing that reality in. Please.
First of all, thank you for introducing me to James Hillman. I was not aware of his work, but this is great, and I'm going to run over to the bookstore. One of the things his magnum opus is Revision in Psychology. And be prepared, you're going to throw it across the room 5 or 6 times. But I've been reading it for 30 years, and I still find new things. But there's a nice book called Blue Fire, which is an anthology of his work edited by Tom Moore, which is a great place to start. Okay, thank you. I think that along with if we're redefining work and understanding work and separating it from economy, I think we need to have a new understanding about money and what money is and what money is not. And money is not wealth. Wealth is what we create that's of service to each other. And I think we have to think about money as enabling the distribution of the gifts that we give to each other through our work, through our service. And so therefore, the notion that we do not have enough money is absolutely ridiculous. Because if you look at money as blood, blood really has no value in our body except that it transports goods, minerals, vitamins, oxygen from one part of the body to another, enables our systems to work together. It eliminates toxins from the body. It helps us do that. So money is like blood. And the body doesn't say, oh, I can't create more blood because I'll create inflation. The body creates new blood because it's in the business of circulation of the wealth of the body. So yeah. I would say to everyone let's just all rethink money. Let's rethink how we create money in this society. And I would propose that we have to take the creation of money back from the bankers and bring it back to the people so that we create money by spending it into the economy and not in debt. We don't need to enslave ourselves in order to create more societal blood.
Thank you. And I think that the first step is this uncoupling. And you see it with Apple. I mean, what John said profits were about is that it allowed them to continue to do what they're doing. Now, you need to go talk to Tim Cook. You need to talk about the new CEO. What are they going to do with all those profits? I mean, there's another challenge that Apple has.
Yes.
I mean, they have so much money. Their profits are so great. It's not just helping them continue to do what they do. So that's another question that they need to be asking. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think the first step is when profits are not your goal,
but then the necessary byproduct to keep you doing what you're doing, then you're thinking about them in blood, the way, what you need
Well,
to
I guess what I'm
nourish
saying
the
is
company.
to charge us politically that we have, Dennis Kucinich just put an option on the table, there's a House bill that would take back the power to create money would close down the Federal Reserve, put it back into the Treasury, and we would spend money into circulation, create jobs, create wealth in this country without debt. So I would just urge all of you to rethink, to learn more about the creation of money. Thomas Jefferson said that if we allow bankers to create our money, very quickly, we, our children, our grandchildren will be slaves. And so I think that's just a critical awareness that we all need to have. Thank you. By the way, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Ah, what neighborhood?
Belt Suver.
Okay. I was in the North Hills most of the time.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Please.
Hi. I understand the concept of separating product from profit, but as a business owner, I didn't understand the hand piece really as the gestural embodiment and how to. I feel like I got a really good piece that I can take back to my business, and in terms of working with my employees and encouraging more focus on the service that we are providing and making that an excellent service. But I don't really understand how to take back the gestural hand.
Okay. Think of it, what I'm talking about with the work instinct is different than what Matthew was talking about yesterday. What I'm trying to talk about is something that maybe is a little bit of the foundation. It's a way of looking at work that allows you to look at the different ways or paths that he talked about. So it's to understand, if we separate work from money, then what's work about? It's about people connecting and then taking up that connection. Think of the gestural body as the taking up. That what you want to do in your organization is set a context, a way of doing things. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is what we're about. The vision, the mission, the values that I think is best, embodied in a story. And then when people have a place in this story, they know how to make sense of things. They know how to engage. So that when you have a problem that comes up, they go, well, who are we? How do we deal with this kind of thing? They're able to dissolve the problem because they're able to engage at a very deep level in a way that's aligned with the values in your narrative. So think about the gestural body as engagement. How do we engage? If you set a way of imagining things, then people want to engage. I don't think anybody ever goes to work wanting to do a bad job. People want to do a good job. They want to be productive. That's the work instinct. They want to get their hands into things. They want to make things happen. They want to see results. So what you want to do is liberate that. You liberate that by providing a context of sense-making. The mission, the vision, the values, who you are and what you do, that then allows people to engage. And think of the gestural body as the engagement. The getting their hands on it. Don't think of it literally. Think of it metaphorically. When someone gets their hands into it, what are they doing? They're into it. They're in relationship to it. They're acting it out. Please.
Wow. Thank you for introducing me to Dr. Hillman as well. My head is spinning and wrapping around what you said. You just had so many incredible things that you made me think about. I just retired from 22 years in public mental health policy. And there is a very disturbing trend that I just went to a conference last week to push against it. And it is a trend in public mental health that is called that we will fund things that have evidence-based practice. And yeah, I know.
Please spell that.
God. Exactly. And my work was in cross-cultural and multicultural mental health. So the multicultural communities in California are pushing back hard against it because of their healing, diversity of techniques, and so much of what this school stands for. So evidence-based practice is, in terms of money, I just hope you can comment on this, is trying to contain cost. So it's putting the economics into mental health in ways I never saw early in the field. And it is a movement that is very strong and moving forward. And some of us have been pushing back in terms of looking at it. And of course, that evidence isn't based on multicultural communities, and that evidence is really poor, and it's really not very scientific from my perspective. But it really has caught fire nationally. And some of us are pushing back a movement called community-defined evidence. They would open a breadth of possibilities. I think the work that is done has been done in this school for years. So ideas, you can say something about this political policy push of evidence-based practice that really is based on containing cost and not about real deep healing, personal awareness. You know the rest.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know what you're talking about, being in the field. And I agree with you completely. It's all about how the argument, in one way, is about what constitutes evidence. And it's so important to broaden that, notion of what. Now, it used to be empirically based. And we were there was a fight within the American Psychological Association that got it shifted over to evidence-based. And there's understood to be 3 sources of evidence. There's statistical studies, there's other kinds of research, and then there's practitioners' own observations. That's where the community come in. So the more we can open that up, the better it's going to be. But there is a move that it is about funding. I mean, last week I was on the phone with an insurance company. I had seen a client 20 times in 6 weeks. I mean, it wasn't 20 times, it was 6 months. So I saw her weekly. And they checked up. I mean, and I said, well, I'm doing very much a psychodynamic-oriented psychotherapy. She had experienced extreme trauma when she was young. We're trying to bring that into conscious awareness and integrate it, and these are the things we're doing. And they said, well, that's not what it's for. This is supposed to be symptom reduction. That's what it is, symptom reduction, because you can measure it, you can quantify it. And they really didn't want to hear what I had to say, and I was stupid. And it took me till halfway through the conversation to say, oh yeah, she has less anxiety and she's sleeping better now. Yeah, no. But she still wakes up a lot, so I think we still need to continue the therapy. It's a sad time. It's a dark time to be a psychologist. But we want to wait the bastards out. I sometimes am not as hopeful a person. I mean, we talked about your kindergarten experience. When I was in kindergarten, I painted rainbows. And they told me that all the colors were in the rainbow. So I put all the colors up there. It turned black. So I'm not really an optimistic kind of person. I see us more like we're sort of in the dark ages, And the goal is to keep this learning alive, to keep these traditions alive until things change. I've kind of given up on the radical changes, but I want to keep things alive and keep a place where we can honor them, we can perpetuate them, we can hand them down. So I tell my students here, just doing what we do right now is of great value because we're keeping something very, very important alive. And of course we want to do more, but we have to honor that is something that's worthwhile. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for the image. It has a multiplicity of meanings for me, and I can see the teacher in the man. The hands. Yeah, Jim talked a lot about the hands. And work. My life's taken place in Silicon Valley, 40 years. I lived through the era where we sent all the hands to Asia. All of them. Intel, all the computer manufacturers, Apple. I literally live in Apple world. Cupertino, my practice is there.
I grew up in San Jose.
There you go. We sent the hands. At one time, there was a lot of hands in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
They were in the assembly plants, and it only took 6 weeks of training to teach people. It only took 6 weeks of training to teach people who didn't speak English to solder wires on an assembly board. And there were tremendous numbers of people well employed in Silicon Valley. Yeah. Intel went to Ireland and what have you, and Apple went to China. We haven't had any hands in Silicon Valley for a decade and a half. I mean, it's a brain trust. Now, I will say this, and then I'm going to go to a question about that, a larger question. Apple is an outlier. Apple Computer is an outlier because Steve was able to keep everybody in there coming to work every day thinking they were building a cathedral.
Yeah. Yep.
They sat in the cubicles and sat behind the computers without really putting their hands on much except a keyboard, but they really thought they were building a cathedral. But if you go up the road to Oracle,
I know where you're going with that one.
you know where I'm going. Okay.
Yeah.
It's just, I worked there for a long time. I was in clinical and organizational practice, and there is a huge shadowy underbelly of that whole Silicon Valley thing.
People
Once-
love them in Pleasanton, huh?
But the hands are gone. The hands are gone. And let's go to our bigger society. So again, it's about the hands. What are we crying, weeping? We're desperate because we've sent all of our manufacturing jobs are gone. Nobody's working with their hands.
Well, I understand what you're saying.
And where can we go with this?
Well, I think what we're trying to do, and I think it was Matthew who talked about it last night. I mean, first off, when we're talking about the gestural hand, it's no longer the anatomical hand, it's not the little hand. So I would disagree. I think there's lots of work going on, hand work going on in Silicon Valley right now. It is ingenuity, yes. But they have their hands in it. So you can have your hands on ideas and work with ideas in this hand way. But there's a whole other side of manufacturing, the work of the hand, that's disappeared. And we have to reimagine this and maybe open up the possibility of other kinds of work that will now be available to people. And that's where our challenge is. That's where we need, and I hope that imagining the hand differently with the gestural hand could be a step towards that. I don't know where to go with it, but I think it might be a step towards it. Thank you.
My hands are in it constantly, every day. It's all that I do. I work with kids, young people, and I work for a company that hires with an application that is a blank paper bag. We give anybody who comes up and asks for a job, we give them a blank paper bag and we say, make this into something and bring it back. And they come back with some of the most fantastic things.
That's great.
But what we're looking for is people who are not frightened by the openness that is a blank paper bag. And as a company, we really foster creativity, and we want and encourage them through the structure of our company to build their creativity and to bring that to work and to enjoy what they do. We teach them manners so they know how to work. I mean, these kids are young, so that we're trying to give them a safe atmosphere to learn how to work and the joy of it, and to learn how to do it on their own later on. And then there's also an aspect of our company where we have seed money that we give out to employees who want to start their own businesses, so that once they come through and learn that paradigm of healthy work, that they can take it out and start new things in it and spread it. But I'd be interested to know what you think about shifting resources from repairing, not just repairing companies that are already in existence, but as a way of growth and looking to the next generation and the super future, like a long time from now, getting people at the ground level.
Yes.
Putting resources into more companies who, within their very structure and by their very purpose, are intended to establish a new paradigm through education.
Yeah, absolutely. And I heard most of what Matthew said as responding to that at that level. Mm-hmm. And it brings in, it's about learning to be in the presence of chaos and to have a sense of the sacred within it. And I don't mean the sacred and the religious, but the other which claims us. Because that's what goes on with creativity. It doesn't come from me, but I'm called to it. I'm claimed by it. So you're teaching kids to be able to be open to that, to not be afraid. Yeah. I mean, fear is the lousiest motivator. But being able to tolerate, the chaos and be able to be receptive to what claims us, that's the future. That's where the future is going to appear. And I think that's what's going on in the work that Matthew talked about with kids, is learning how to do that. I think, and I also think that when I was doing, a few years back in Pittsburgh when we were doing narrative work, we really tried to work with startups because that was so important, getting that story that gave them a sense of who they were, that created the kind of culture, because I think the culture comes out of narrative, the kind of culture which does what you said, allows people to be creative, and allows the work instinct to flourish.
It does. Amy has a very strong, my boss, has a very strong story, and she tells it to every new generation of employees that comes in. We have a customer service class, and she speaks at every single one, and she tells why she's doing what she's doing and how she got here. And it perpetuates this understanding from day one. It's beautiful.
It perpetuates it, and then when you get more and more skillful, when the story expands, you tell a story that people want to see themselves in.
Yeah.
They find a place in the story.
Because they
and
see
then
the hope.
when they're participating in the story gets better, and who they want to be gets better.
It does.
And that's when things are really dynamic. That's when it's powerful.
Thank you, Michael. I'm struggling a little bit with the idea of separating work from the job. We go back to the point and say that work is what we do every day. Where did that come from? I mean, is this so endemic to the human psyche that it was there for?
Yes, I think from the way I'm talking about with Hillman, work is fundamental to being human. That work is our engagement with the world that transforms it into something that relates to us. That we always have our hands on things and we transform them so they relate to us and we relate to it. It establishes that connection. And it's that connection which opens up the human context. The mythic figure for work for Vico was Hercules. And his clearing of the primeval forest, which opened the place for the polis, the human context, to appear. So that is without it, Vico has 3 ages. The first age is an age of barbarism of sense, and where things are just chaotic. But then through ingenuity, there's the creation of the human context. But then there's a period of disintegration, which we could get into maybe later, but we want to stay on the upside. Please.
Many of you probably heard the PBS series that came out a couple of years ago by Daniel Pink. It was called, his book is called A Whole New Mind, and the series was called Living on the Right Side of the Brain. It's a takeoff of Betty Edwards' book on thinking on the right side of the brain. What it really did was, I thought, give a very nice overview of the 6 practices or so that he's identified that will lead as a challenge for America to come up with jobs that are high concept and high touch. And both of your 2 phrases, Michael, get your mind around it and get your hands in it, really would be comparable to what he was getting at. Coming up with high concept jobs that cannot be routinized and therefore shipped to any country to do at lower costs.
Yeah.
And also get our life and our heart into what we do so that it is customer service really related and that we are present in our work in a spirit of love, care, and service. So it might be very interesting if you haven't seen it. It was a PBS series.
I will check it out. It
probably
sounds
3 years ago.
quite consonant with this.
Michael, some years ago I was asked to be involved in a group thinking about